The hot.
You might need a parking area too.
Yeah.
You might be a little.
I got one parking spot out there. I didn't know what to do.
Should we get this? We haven't got the signs up.
Somebody parked out there with no parking.
There's no sign that says you can't. So.
That's why someone needs to carry a sign with them, overflow parking, wherever they're at.
I like how you think. Check. They took the hat off. As soon as Scott walks back in, we'll go.
Okay.
Morning. And now my alternate walked away.
They just like to make you sweat, that's all.
This is how I run a meeting. All right, we'll wait for Bob. I know. We'll wait for him.
Meeting.
Good morning. Welcome to the MAPC Advanced Plans Committee for Thursday, October 24th. I am your chair this morning, Brian Fry. So first thing we'll do is a roll call. Joe Johnson, absent. Cindy Miles, absent. John McKay. Semi-absent. Chuck Warren, absent. Hugh Nix. Here. Leon Mader, absent. So in the absence of a quorum, our bylaws allow me to use an alternate from the subdivision committee. And with Mr. Bob Aldrich here, he will serve until we get a full quorum of the Advanced Plans Committee. So, Mr. Aldrich, are you here?
Well, yes, I am.
All right, thank you, sir. Next order of business is item 2, the meeting summary approval from September 12th. I show Commissioner Mader absent. I have a motion to approve. We have a motion from Commissioner Nix and a second from Commissioner McKay. All in favor say aye. All opposed say nay.
Abstain.
One abstain, thank you. So motion passes 3, with 1 abstain. Okay, next item is 3, daycare, Unified Zoning Code update. Justin Costantino.
Good morning, everybody. Justin Costantino with the Planning Department. Next slide, please. Here's a nice photo of what a daycare operation would look like. Next slide, please. So we are talking about daycare general use in residential zoning districts. The purpose of this agenda item is to provide you some background information on the daycare general use, some differences between the daycare general and daycare limited use, answer any questions that you might have, and then ultimately make a recommendation to the full MAPC regarding potential changes to the Unified Zoning Code about this use in residential zoning districts. Next slide, please. We're going to discuss definitions. As I mentioned before, there is a difference between the daycare general use and the daycare limited use, so we'll talk about that. We'll talk about our current process. Again, we'll go over possible changes to the Unified Zoning Code, and then we will discuss a recommended action to the MAPC. Next slide, please. So currently there is the daycare general and daycare limited use as defined in the Unified Zoning Code. And then we'll talk a little bit about the home occupation definition too. The home occupation definition is typically linked to the daycare limited use. And I'll go into that more specifically on the next few slides. Next slide, please. So the daycare general is a daycare center that provides care, protection, and supervision for more than 12 individuals. And this is not operated as a home occupation. So generally considered more of a commercial business traditionally, but that's how the Unified Zoning Code defines it, as no more than 12 individuals, no more than 12 children, I guess is a good way of putting it too. Again, this is not operated as a home occupation. So this would just be kind of considered a general business with general business hours. We'll go to the next slide and I'll talk about daycare limited a little bit. This is a home occupation. So home occupation being a role or a business that occurs in a residential dwelling, no more than 12 individuals. So really the difference between the two is the intensity. Daycare general is kind of considered a more intense use, more of a commercial use, where daycare limited exists as a home occupation. The whole point is to provide some flexibility and allow for daycare to be allowed within a residential home. Next slide, please. Home occupation, just to get deeper into it, it's incidental and accessory home occupations. They ensure that the language is there to ensure that the home occupations don't adversely affect the integrity of residential and rural areas. So within the Unified Zoning Code, we have a list of uses that are allowed as home occupations, and those uses are generally considered a bit less intense. They are there to provide certain commercial activities within residential zoning districts. Next slide, please. Currently, with the daycare general use, it is currently requires a conditional use permit. So as it stands right now, if you want to have a daycare general use, again, just to reiterate, this is 12 or more. It is currently allowed in single family, 2-family, rural residential, and other districts. However, a conditional use permit is required. So they would need to submit an application. It would go to the MAPC for a full public hearing. The MAPC would make a recommendation to the City Council for final approval. Next slide, please. Not to confuse with prior amendments that took place early in February of 2024, we did make some changes to the daycare limited use, which was to increase the maximum allowed children in a home occupation to match KDHE standards. So KDHE changed their allowance from 10 to 12 children. So back early at the beginning of this year, we made some changes. I just wanted to bring that up so as not to confuse it with this issue. Next slide, please. Daycare general, the possible changes that we're making today, so this is why we're here, is to allow the daycare general use, again, this is 12 or more, in the single family, two family, and manufactured residential housing districts through the establishment of an administrative permit process. And I'll go into that a little bit more on the next slide. So the way that this would look would be very similar to the way that we established short-term rentals late last year. The daycare general use would always require an administrative permit or a conditional use when located in the SF5, SF10, TF3, and MH zoning districts. The administrative permit would require a written notification stating the nature of the proposed use. That would come from the applicant. And then we would mail that notification to all property owners of land that abut and are contiguous to the application area. Let's go to the next slide. I'll show you an example. It'll be the one after this, but basically that application for that administrative permit, that is subject to approval by the planning director. Again, a lot like short-term rentals, there is a 14-day protest period, and if more than 50% of all owners of record of land that abut and are contiguous to that subject property file a written protest petition, then that application becomes a conditional use case, and that would go to the MAPC. Again, the process is very similar to the administrative permit review process for STRs. Next slide, please. Here's kind of what that looks like. The subject property highlighted in that mustard yellow, and then the blue properties immediately surrounding it. So it would be front, rear, and side neighbors immediately, and then of course any kind of neighboring property across the street too would also receive a notification regarding someone's desire to put in a daycare general use on a residential property. Next slide, please. The owner would be the one receiving that. So all owners of record for a property would be the individual receiving that notification. Next slide. Here's kind of another example of what that would look like. We wanted to provide at least two. This one's kind of funky because it shows, there's multiple properties that surround this individual subject property. You can see the mustard property there and then all the blue lots. But really any neighboring property that is touching the subject property, even with a street, would receive a notification. Next slide, please. So what the process looks like is we are bringing this draft update to you now. Advanced plans would make ultimately a recommendation, and then this item will also be heard by the City Council at an upcoming meeting in November. Following this recommendation, the MAPC would take a look at these proposed regulations and then make a recommendation to the Wichita City Council for final approval, and then ultimately to the Board of County Commissioners as well. Next slide, please. So again, the recommended action today is to review these changes, have some discussion, and ultimately recommend changes to the Unified Zoning Code regarding the daycare general use in residential zoning districts through the use of a newly created administrative permit process. That concludes this portion of the presentation, and I'm available for any questions.
All right, thank you, Justin. Do any members of the commission have, Mr. McKay?
On the notification, does it direct if he's touching the property, located in the notification area?
Yes, sir, correct.
Okay.
Or across the street.
Okay, still, that's connected because, right. What about the person that's not within 200 feet? Not being run away?
So yes, that's the big distinction one of the big distinctions between the administrative permit process and regular conditional use. is that the notification and the protest area for an administrative permit, it's reduced to just the properties that touch or directly across the street, minus the streets, would they be touching? So that is the administrative permit. Well, that's correct, and they're different. So this effectively, the administrative permit process effectively reduces that. Now, if they receive protests from over 50% of the owners of those abutting and contiguous properties, then effectively the administrative permit is denied, and then the owner or the applicant has the opportunity to either file for a conditional use or just say they're not going to proceed any further.
That's the reason why I asked that question, but let's say it goes through the process, you just got through saying, it went through. Then does the 200 feet come into play? Because then it's the whole thing.
It does, yes. For the conditional use process, it would.
Second question I had is, we're gonna have this committee's gonna have a chance to do a working session with that one before we do any recommendations.
You certainly can. So,
Feel better because there's not very many people here today.
yeah, we can. We've got it set up where we could go for. If you recommend this to the full MAPC, we could have this to them on November 7th. We can always take as much time as you want to kind of know the ins and outs of it. So if you would rather see it at advanced plans again on the 7th, we can certainly do that instead of scheduling for MAPC.
Okay.
I don't know, the dates that I certain, like November 7th, has to be the date.
No.
I'd like to see that this committee has a semi-working session to review what we're going on. Let him go through more than just review what he did now.
Okay.
I'm sorry to interrupt, Mr. McKay, if you could use your microphone just so that the camera picks up on it.
Do I have to ask all of those things again? Because I can't remember them.
No, sir. I think we've got on the record, we've got my responses, so I think that should be good for up to now.
No, I just wanted a clarification because, when we went through the bylaws, we went through the same thing we're going through here.
Right.
No sense in not changing it now.
Mr. Commissioner Nix.
So you mentioned manufactured homes as well. When you toss that, it'd have to be a double wide, wouldn't it? How would you accommodate 12 individuals, whatever an individual is? I don't know what an individual is, but
Sure.
can you tell me what that is?
Sure. Go ahead, Scott.
Yeah, sorry for jumping in so much, but for the manufactured housing, something to keep in mind is that there's the city standards, but then there's also KDHE standards, and the KDHE standards trump what the city standards are in terms of the amount of space that's required for kids. So even though the zoning code may say up to 12, if there's not enough space to meet the KDHE standards for 12 kids, then they get whatever, then they can be licensed up to whatever that amount is. So for a mobile home, the space is generally pretty small. And I think you're asking the question about, well, what about a double wide? That certainly increases it, but I don't know to what degree for how many kids.
So I am new here, so an individual or a kid, what age are we talking about? Is there a cutoff? Is there a limit here, or what? How's that work?
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing because it doesn't give you a description or an age limit. It just says individuals. Does that open up? Because it just says that provides care.
So I think under KDHE standards, probably up to and maybe not exceeding 18. However, there is adult daycare.
Right, so that,
And this would be applicable. This isn't necessarily just for children. It would be applicable for both.
so just to understand, Mr. Cox, you're saying that this would allow adult daycare up to 12 by administrative permit?
So 12 is the number for home occupation. Group settings, group operations, their number is going to be established by KDHE based on space and staff. So it could be 12, it could be 8, it could be 30.
Well, what about parking issues? Because if
Hold on, let's stay on I want to make sure we get this tied off real quick because there's a lot of vagueness right here. And again, I'm all for wanting to help the daycare situation, but I also don't want to open up another can of worms by allowing now more than 12 adult individuals to be in a daycare general by administrative permit.
And one point that I think is important is that we're talking about daycare. We're not talking about a residence there in terms of residing there. So this is not a group home. This is a location where people are dropped off and generally in the morning, could happen in the evening though, hypothetically, but they're dropped off. They don't reside there. They're there for care and someone watching over them for a period of time, and then they go back to their residence.
But does there need to be a definition somewhere in this deal defining exactly what you just got through saying?
Well, there is a definition on Article 2B4, but that really talks more about school age and certain types of non-activity that relates to school. So also let the record show that Commissioner Joe Johnson just arrived.
Thank you.
Welcome. Okay, so I don't know where we left off. There was a hand raised over here.
No, I was just making a comment that if there's going to be a designation difference, there should be. It may be there, and I haven't looked at that.
Yes, that's actually just what I wanted to comment on is in the paperwork, and I'm sorry I don't have a page number for the packet, but there is Article 2B4, which provides the definition of daycare, and I'll read it just for simplicity. It says daycare means an establishment that provides care, protection, and supervision for individuals on a regular basis away from their primary residence for less than 24 hours per day. The term does not include the following, and it goes into explain kindergartens, schools. It does not include facilities that are operated in connection with a shopping center or other principal activity where essentially, kids are taken care of while their parents are doing other things, shopping, etc. Specialized activity programs or a preschool operated by a church or place of worship as an accessory use.
That still doesn't give me the difference between
An
the
adult.
definition of group home and daycare home for adults.
Okay, so currently for daycare, we don't see a distinction between adults and children. It could be either one. A group home, that's a state-regulated residential dwelling facility where the folks live who have disabilities or handicaps and need assistance with daily functions of living. So those are not at all the same, but for daycare, even now, it's adult, it's child, it's whichever one they're licensed for. I don't know the last time we saw an adult daycare facility. What we usually see are the child daycare facilities.
Mm-hmm.
I think the terms that help on the definition of daycare is that it says it provides care and protection for supervision of individuals. So therefore, we know that these folks are being supervised. But the big distinction from a group home is that for individuals on a regular basis away from their primary residence for less than 24 hours per day. So it's for people who are not at their primary residence. And we know that it's not like a hotel or something like that because it says for less than 24 hours a day. So those two items, not their primary residence and that people are not away from their residence for more than 20 at this location that they're not away from their residence for more than 24 hours per day. So those two combined, I think, are what made the big distinction between this and a group home.
Does KDHE language, let the record state that Commissioner Mader has arrived. Welcome. Does KDHE regulations have any definition on age as it relates to child daycare?
Oh, yes, they do.
So I think we should look at some of that language and maybe incorporate that into this recommendation.
So if I'm hearing right, the intent here is just for children?
Well, that's where it originated from, I believe, correct?
Correct.
But I think we've opened up a possible wormhole with this
I mean, it currently,
being vagueness.
I guess that wormhole exists currently. If it's a wormhole.
Yeah.
So it's simply, basically what it's doing, to my mind, it's taking what already exists in our code as a conditional use, because it currently exists as a conditional use. You can do this by con,
Right.
and it makes it an administrative permit process, so a streamlined process, as opposed to a conditional use unless it's properly protested. But if we can do, I mean, probably, I think, general age limits would be under 18 down to 1 day for childcare, as opposed to adult. Adult will be 18 or up for 18th birthday.
Commissioner Nix.
I don't want to prolong this conversation, but say I wanted to open up a daycare and I live in a neighborhood that has a homeowners association. I understand the map and how far you have to, but does it extend further than that?
So there's a couple of things that come into play there. Number one is if you live in an HOA and they've got covenants, that can be a private agreement between the parties. So we don't, even though the zoning may allow you to have a daycare there, you may have private covenants that restrict or prohibit you from doing that. So that's first thing. Number two is with the administrative permit process, only the owners of the properties that are abutting and contiguous are notified. With a conditional use process, what we do is we notify everyone within the certain distance, depending on the size of the property, generally 200 feet in the city for a home. But we also do a courtesy notice, which is an email to an HOA or neighborhood association if they're registered with the city and we have their contact info. So that's the distinction between the two.
I'm going to follow up on a line of questioning that I believe Commissioner McKay had. Notification, it will be by mail only to those adjacent properties. There will be no signage or posted notice, correct?
Correct, and it would be mailed to the property owner.
Right, but no other notification, no signage.
Right.
Okay, and on a daycare limited, that is currently just administrative permit process? It's by right?
It's by right, home occupation.
Okay, all right. Did I see a question from Commissioner Aldrich?
Yeah, and again, my mind goes back to parking. You know, if you're allowed, have to have one parking space per 4 occupants. And if especially if you're in a modular home park or something like that, you only got 2 spaces to park. So how is that going to be handled?
I don't think at this point that aspect has been handled. On the surface, they would have to meet all applicable code requirements. So if the parking standard requires, say, 5 spaces, they'd have to have 5 spaces.
When it was increased to follow KDHE from 10 to 12, was there an increase in staff for that?
Yes, possibly. So with KDHE, their focus is the care of the child.
Right.
So depending on the ages of the child and the numbers, they would determine staff levels, and there possibly could be a change in staff. As a home occupation, however, if you're in single family zoning, you're not supposed to have staff other than a substitute. So I haven't heard that that's become a problem, but that would have been the same as whether it was 10 or whether it was 12. So.
And for general, more than 12, there's no limit on more than 12?
It would be KDHE determining what that.
Based on square
number
footage?
and staffing and ages of the kids and.
But that doesn't help with the parking situation then. If it was in a residential area, depending upon staff and how large the building is.
Right, there's a parking standard in the code, and I think Scott's probably got it.
So here's the parking standard that's in the code. It's 1 space per teacher/employee plus 1 per vehicle used in the center. So if they have like a van or something that they take for field trips, plus 1 per 10 children based on enrollment above 12 children. So if they have 22 children, that would be
2.
that'd be 1 additional space to account for those 10 over 12.
So if you had 10, there wouldn't be any required.
That is the way I read that, except for that there's one per teacher/employee.
Any other questions? Yes, sir, Mr. Wadle.
Sir, I just have one more point because there was a pretty good discussion yesterday during agenda review. If we could, for the folks in the back, if we could bring up the slide that shows the notification area. And Justin, I think we had talked about this as part of that discussion. I want to make sure that people, that we do a good job explaining the protest process and who can protest and how. This is perfect. If you could leave it on that slide. And I've asked Philip to come in and join us because his team has been administering the process for the administrative permits and the protest. And so Philip, if you don't mind, I hate to do this on the spot, but if you could explain how the protests are counted in this kind of scenario where you've got the church as one property owner, and they actually own 3 different properties shown on this map. They own the church buildings and then the parking lot to the north.
Yes, for the record, Philip Zievenbergen with planning staff. So the protest is based off of eligible properties. In this scenario, the church owns 3 properties because they're individually outlined. They have individual tax parcels. The church could up and sell this piece of property. They could technically sell this piece of property. In this scenario, there is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 eligible properties. If the church were to submit a protest, we would encourage them and likely reach out to them that they submit 1 per property. So essentially they get 3 votes. In this scenario, a valid protest requires over 50, with the short-term rental, the valid protest requires over 50% of the eligible properties. So in this scenario where there's 7 total properties, you would need at least 4 properties to protest the application in order for it to become a conditional use. If the church had consolidated their tax numbers and owned 1 large piece of property, then there would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 eligible properties in this scenario, and the church would be getting 1 vote because they would have only owned 1 property. But at the same time, the number of eligible properties is less to where your over 50% is only 3 properties instead of the 4 when it was 7 eligible properties. So it just depends on how properties are broken up by tax parcel when you have 1 common owner. Is it 1 contiguous parcel? Is it 1 large piece of land? In this case, this one's still broken up into multiple tax parcels, and so they would actually have multiple votes and multiple eligible properties to protest.
Thank you, Philip. I just wanted to make sure everyone was clear on the protest.
Okay, one question, Phil. A lot of churches are multi-owner, especially churches that are nonprofit, will have 3 or 4 properties around their place, and they use their mailing address to the church for notification. Does this mean each one of them is going to have a tax ID number to be classified as individual? Is that what you're talking about?
Right. And so, and I can defer to Scott on this. We haven't had a situation in a protest where we've had 1 entity owning multiple tax parcels. But common sense would say if the church in this situation were to submit a protest, we would likely count all 3 of the properties that they own toward that, if that makes sense. So instead of as 3, just because I see what you're saying. Each one of these parcels does not have a mailing address. There's 1 mailing address for all of it. And again, common sense would dictate that if the church were to protest the application, all of the property in which they own is protesting it.
But the protesters need to know that.
Right. And that's where, again, when it comes to these things, even when it comes to protesting applications that are going to planning commission and our zoning items and things like that, depending on when we receive the protest within the protest period, we do have the opportunity to work with property owners if they do own multiple tax parcels.
So this is just a hypothetical. This is not a real situation here, just hypothetical.
Yeah, this was hypothetical to help explain to you all, and that's kind of why we had this map as an example, because
I know it's hypothetical, but have you ever had a church protest a daycare center? I mean, usually they're located
Well-
in the church.
Well, again, this is hypothetical
It's them.
go for, say it's a short-term rental application. I know we're talking about daycares here. I'm not sure if people are going to be protesting, like large organizations are likely not going to protest daycares. But the idea is if you have a large entity, whether it's a church or some type of business or nonprofit or something, and they own a large piece of land with incorporates multiple tax parcels around the subject property.
And other things. And so we're just gonna
Okay.
Great, thank you.
lay this out
Thank you. Appreciate that, Philip. Any other questions for staff?
kind of just do a little
Anyone from the public have any comments on this item?
of this.
Seeing none, bring it back. Echoing Commissioner McKay's earlier comments, I know that this is first opportunity for many members of the commission to see these recommended changes. And again, being an advocate for childcare improvements and the challenge that industry has right now, I can understand the need to open this up. I guess I'm a little uncomfortable with just doing this by administrative permit, considering the impact it could have on residential neighborhoods. So I think it's wise for us to table this until our next advanced plan so we can review and study it a little bit. There is no rush that this has to get approved right away, but allows us to take this. And I also think we need to clean up that language as it relates to the age. I know what you're saying, JR. I feel more comfortable if we could have a little bit more definition on it related to daycare for children.
So,
And then where do you want this one?
so I want to be clear, in your mind, you're focusing this just on children, not adults.
Because I believe that was the intent to begin with, from what I understand the process that has been to this point. I don't think anyone anticipated the wormhole that it could expose by leaving it vague. So I just like to think through it.
So we might need to actually make two separate definitions in, because as I
Right.
said, that wormhole,
Yeah,
it exists today, we just don't.
Just hasn't had it
see-
come
We just
to
don't
it.
see them.
it just hasn't come to us yet, yeah.
Right.
So I
Jack.
have a couple of commissioners, Mr. Nix.
JR, so maybe this is kind of an odd question, but you have to have a certain number of square feet to accommodate X numbers of children. And we talked about that, we talked about modular homes, and so you've got to have a certain amount of space. But, generally, kids go outside. So is there any requirement at all in terms of what size yard you have to have? I mean, a lot of homes are just jammed right up on top of one another. I mean, it wouldn't make any sense to send the kids out in a really confined, small backyard unless they were free-range kids, like chickens or something, you know what I mean?
Which we were when I was young, but.
Yeah, but it seemed like you'd want a larger property, but maybe that doesn't even come into play.
We don't, we being the city. KDHE has
Right.
standards on that type of activity.
This doesn't have anything to do with the backyards, but in your definition, you talk about manufactured housing. And manufactured housing is a little bit different than modular housing in the eyes of the KDHE and the federal government.
So the MH is manufactured housing, but that's a zoning district. So it might be a park of manufactured homes, it might be modulars, it might be a subdivision with site-built homes. MH is a district. It's not necessarily saying you can have it in a manufactured home. You can have it in the MH district.
Okay. Okay, so I know recommended action was to review and approve for forwarding to the MAPC, but based on the discussion today, I'm going to ask that we defer this until our next Advanced Plans Committee meeting to get this opportunity to review it, make sure we're answering all of our internal questions before we make a recommendation to MAPC. Okay? So, Justin, next, we don't need a vote
Mr.
for
Chairman.
that.
I think we do need a
Do you
vote.
need a vote for that? Okay, so that is my motion to defer until the next Advanced
Second.
Plans Committee meeting. That's my motion. We have a second by Commissioner McKay. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed say nay. Motion passes unanimously. Thank you. Appreciate that, Abigail. Item 4, Event Center in the County.
Good morning again, everybody. Justin Constantino with the Planning Department. Number 4, event centers in the county. We'll go to the next slide, please. So the purpose of this agenda item is to provide you some background information on event centers in the county, answer any questions that you may have. And again, this is an actionable item. The request is to make a full recommendation to the MAPC regarding potential changes to the Unified Zoning Code regarding event centers in the county. Next slide, please. For the purpose of this discussion, I'll give you a little bit of background about kind of how we got here, potential changes and updates to the Unified Zoning Code. We'll talk about existing feedback that we've received. We have taken this to the Board of County Commissioners, so I'll provide you with their thoughts and feedback as well, and then we will discuss the draft review and update process. Next slide, please. A little bit of background. Here's kind of a good photo of what an event center in the county might look like. Next slide. So we did make changes to the Unified Zoning Code in 2016. More than 20 acres are provided or allowed by right for event centers. Less than 20 acres requires a conditional use for an event center. We have, since 2016, received multiple complaints. The Board of County Commissioners have mentioned that they have received complaints regarding noise, trash, traffic and dust, temporary signage. Lighting was also another concern. We brought this issue to the Board of County Commissioners in October of 2023 just to kind of provide them with an update on the existing regulations, and then we did so again in December of 2023. Next slide, please. So event center in the county is currently defined in the Unified Zoning Code as premises that are frequently rented out for public or private activities that are not repeated on a weekly basis and that are not open to the public on a daily basis at times other than when the event is scheduled. Next slide, please. So currently, again, this is the existing regulations. They are permitted in limited commercial and general commercial zoning districts, as well as the limited industrial and general industrial zoning districts. They are in rural residential. If the property is less than 20 acres, greater than 20 acres, it is in compliance with the applicable conditions in the Unified Zoning Code. If the property in our zoning district is less than 20 acres, a conditional use is required. That's our existing regulations as it's on the books today. Next slide, please. Parking. We do require on-site parking. There is one space per 4 occupants. Aisles and parking surface must meet the fire district approval. ADA parking needs to be provided and needs to be hard surfaced. Lighting should be downcast, shielded, and there is a height limitation. Next slide, please. These are our existing regulations. This is just a good photo from our actual UZC defining an event center in the county, and that they are permitted by right on sites 20 acres or greater. Next slide, please. Getting into other communities. Next slide, please. We did do a best practices report on what other communities in Kansas are doing. We looked at, I believe, 10 counties to see if they have specific regulations on event centers in the county. Next slide. And what we found is that the majority of the counties do not currently have regulations in their zoning code. 20% of the remaining counties do have specific regulations, whereas the remaining 20% were actively working on establishing some sort of language in their code. Next slide, please. So one of the things that we looked at when we were reviewing other counties and looking at best practices were kind of the typical concerns. And of course, they matched up with what we had been hearing from the Board of County Commissioners. Traffic, drunk driving was certainly a concern. Noise, lights, late hours, trespassing onto neighboring or adjacent properties, just general compliance with codes. The image that you see there is a zoning practice document from the American Planning Association, who wrote a paper on this subject because it is becoming more prevalent in rural communities. We'll go to the next slide, please. Possible changes. So here we're going to get into the language, the draft language in the Unified Zoning Code. Next slide, please. So possible changes include changes to the Unified Zoning Code. Again, that's that exact language in the code specifying what you can and can't do with this type of use. The comprehensive plan being more of a general document, speaking more in broad terms, we thought it could be potentially of interest to add language to the comprehensive plan addressing event centers in the county, because that is not specifically addressed in the comprehensive plan now. And again, a permitting process. Right now, a permitting process does not exist, but we wanted to put this up there to potentially generate discussion on this topic. Next slide, please. So again, the zoning code, this is kind of what that would look like, and that's what you have in your packet now is marked changes and then clean changes of possible updates to the UZC. Next slide, please. Currently, the way we have it written is that we made an increase in the acreage required for this event center in the county use. Minimum property size, the owner must have a minimum of 40 acres of contiguous property. Now, that doesn't necessarily have to be all one parcel, but one of the possible changes is increasing that number from 20 acres to 40 acres. Next slide, please. Also would be the creation of conditional use in our rural residential district, and then by right, it would be allowed in LC and GC, limited commercial and general commercial, as well as limited and general industrial. We would require a site plan for by right and conditional uses. So we would like to see kind of more what's happening on the ground with that structure and what their plans are for mitigating some of those issues. Next slide, please. Setbacks, 200 feet minimum setback from the property line and 300 feet from any existing residential dwellings not on the site. And I have a graphic to illustrate that on, I believe, on the next slide. So what you see here is an example subject property. You could see the 200 feet distance and the 300 feet distance marked as well. So those purple lines depict the 200 feet from the front, rear, and side property lines, and then that bubble on the west side kind of depicts what it would look like 300 feet from the nearest residential dwelling unit. Next slide, please. Maximum number of guests, no more than 299 unless permitted by Sedgwick County through another process. And then the hours of operation, as I mentioned before, noise was a concern. So we put in hours of operation from 9 o'clock a.m. to 9 o'clock p.m. from Monday through Thursday and Sunday. And then 9 o'clock a.m. to midnight on Friday and Saturday. Next slide, please. Screening, generally not required unless determined by the MAPC or the governing body. Again, site plan required for by right and conditional use permits. Next slide, please. Locational guidelines, this is into the comprehensive plan. This is a recommended change in the comprehensive plan. As I mentioned before, rural event centers were not discussed in that document, but we created this language stating that rural event centers for public or private activities are discouraged near residential subdivisions and or sensitive land uses, and they should have restrictions that mitigate nuisance or hazard impacts on surrounding properties, including noise, light, dust, parking, trash, and debris. So again, this is in the comprehensive plan, separate from the Unified Zoning Code. This does not currently address rural event centers, but this would be additional language that we would put into that comprehensive plan document. Next slide, please. Possible changes to permitting. Again, this is something that does not exist, but the concept would be to establish a permitting process for event centers in the county, separate from the Unified Zoning Code and from the comprehensive plan. The applicability for a permitting process would be temporary permit, private events, and event centers in the county if above the zoning occupancy limit. Next slide, please. So basically, with permitting, one of the things that we would be looking at is discussion today on that process, what that process could potentially look like, whether or not we want to have an attendance maximum, whether or not there should be hours, amplified noise, a lot of the same issues that we've been discussing. Should we apply that to a permitting process that we would create through this process? Next slide, please. Feedback received so far, we have brought this to the Board of County Commissioners twice, once in September and then again in October. I'll go to the next slide and kind of give you an update on what we heard from the Board of County Commissioners. The feedback was that we are generally headed in a positive direction. This is something that they would like to see addressed. One of the permitting questions that came up, or one of the comments that came up from one of the commissioners, was that it should apply to over 100 people for permitting, and whether or not these operations should have to register as a business, and discussion about how to measure noise being a very significant concern. I'll go into noise a little bit more on the future slide. So next slide, please. Again, we went back to the Board of County Commissioners with their feedback that we received in September. We just had a recent meeting with them at their staff meeting in October. And one of the big discussion points that came up was noise. We did invite the Sheriff's Office to that meeting. MABCD was, I believe, in attendance at that meeting as well, just as a code enforcement and law enforcement presence. As far as noise, we talked about potentially increasing the setback distance from existing dwelling units. As I mentioned before, that's currently listed at 300 feet. Interior noise mitigation, whether or not these structures should have some sort of padding or some sort of noise reduction elements added to those physical structures. Exploring the decibel level enforcement. There was a lot of discussion regarding decibel levels and how the Sheriff's Office would enforce that. And then the need to specify that doors be closed for indoor events. You know how these things go. If there's a large barn and they're playing music inside, it's a hot evening, the doors are open. Should we find a way to reduce that noise? Next slide, please. So this is what our current noise ordinance states. This is from the City of Wichita Code of Ordinances. We do have that set based on residential, commercial, light industrial, and industrial zones. That is split into two columns. The column on the left, 8 a.m., 10 o'clock p.m., specifies anywhere from a range of 55 to 80 decibels, 55 being residential, 80 being the max at industrial. And then the second column shows 10 p.m. to 8 o'clock a.m. So during the evening hours, that range is anywhere from 50 decibels to 75 decibels, 75 for more intense industrial uses, and then 50 for residential uses. That's currently existing in the Code of Ordinances. Next slide, please. I mentioned that APA best practice document. That document specifically mentioned Riley County in Kansas. They currently have a 65 decibel or greater level restriction at the property line. So within their code currently, they are one of the few counties that we actually know of that have existing decibel regulations on the books. And then again, that APA guide mentions Riley County. It might also mention another county in Tennessee, but it does discuss decibel enforcement as a possible option, but does say that not many counties currently use that. Next slide, please. Draft review and update process. Next slide. So currently we are at MAPC Advanced Plans for October. We would be bringing this item, if it were to be recommended for approval today, to the November 7th MAPC meeting. Following that would be final approval by the Board of County Commissioners and then the Wichita City Council for updates to the Unified Zoning Code. Next slide, please. Again, the recommended action is to review these changes to the Unified Zoning Code regarding event centers and make a recommendation to the full MAPC. and I'm available for any questions.
Thank you, Justin. Open up for commissioner comments. Commissioner Nix.
So in the past, we've had a lot of discussion, whether it's in the city or whether it's in the county, about noise and regulation and measuring it and enforcement and all of that. I just wondered how excited the sheriff's department was when you had the conversation with them about going out into the county in the middle of 40 acres and enforcing some sort of noise where a party got a little bit out of control.
So, so we did meet with the sheriff in several meetings prior to those Board of County Commissioners meetings. He did attend those meetings, and he did speak on that a little bit. I can't speak for his office, but the discussion of decibels was discussed at that Board of County Commissioners meeting. There was actually a robust discussion amongst the sheriff and the Board of County Commissioners at our most recent October meeting. So that did come up. Scott, you want to?
I'll go a little bit further.
Sure.
I think that's a really good answer. I'll go further to say, I believe that the sheriff has been reluctant to do noise enforcement for exactly that reason of having to have staff go out there and take the readings. However, in the conversation with the BOCC at the most recent staff meeting, I think the sheriff did indicate that they could and were open to doing noise enforcement specifically for event centers and event centers only. So not to have a countywide noise regulation for all uses, but specifically just for event centers out in the county. I think he expressed being open to doing that.
Commissioner Aldridge.
Yeah, I was thinking about the same thing, especially using Riley County as an example. There is no separation between a municipal police or Riley because it's all Riley. It's all the sheriff's department that handles all the law enforcement and stuff there. And, they have a higher density, within a municipality of what you do out in the country. There's a reason why it's out in the country. It's wide open spaces. And, to me, it seems sort of silly and not feasible to go ahead and make some sort of noise regulations out in the county. At what point, and then how do you do your same decibels? You can't match it up to the city because it's, again, it's higher density and sound's going to travel a little bit further in wide open spaces. So it's going to be tough. That's sort of like herding cats in a way.
Well, I just second what Bob has to say as well. If you're working ground late at night and you're out in the county, I'm pretty sure the big tractor or whatever it is that you're using might make as much noise or more than somebody having a party out in a barn.
Just for clarification, these changes that you're asking us to approve today does not address any sound ordinance. You're not making any recommendations. We just discussed this as possibility, but there's not any recommendation for sound ordinance in these changes today.
Correct. Regarding decibel level, no. This language specifically addresses hours of operation.
And no amplified music after 10?
Yes.
Okay. I guess I'm just a little confused on the 40 acres versus the 20 and 20 less. Could you review that one more time with me? Because I'm trying to make sure I understand that.
Sure, and we might be able to pull up this slide. I don't know if you can go to the 2040 slide, type in, but currently as it is required now, it's 20 acres to, I believe it's a conditional.
20 acres or less.
20 acres or less, yes. Requires a conditional use. 20 acre and more than 20 acres is by right. And then we would be expanding that from 20 to 40. So basically, we're increasing the property size for event centers that would be allowed on.
So by right, it'll be 40 or more.
An important, good question, good answer. Additional dialogue on it is part of this came from, I think we've seen a number of event centers in the county that are on relatively small properties. So I'd say 5 acres or less. They've come to you all, they've gone to the county commission and they have been denied. And so in that way, I think part of the exercise has been to look and say, okay, maybe that's not a good fit for the community kind of overall. So this discussion, as we've been talking about this, where staff started was, okay, so we've seen them get approved for larger properties. We've seen them get denied for smaller properties. What if we had a requirement that they have to be a certain acreage? Now, we know that that can be an issue because if they're going to get building permits for a commercial scale kind of event centers like they've got, they're going to have to plat a property. And we know that folks don't want to come and plat a 40-acre property. So the way the regulations, these draft regulations are written, it would be you've got to have 40 acres in order to have the event center, but they can be split up into multiple properties. So you could have,
I get that.
yeah. So there would be a minimum of 40 acres. And JR, I need your help on this one. It's the minimum of 40 acres in order to have the event center in any situation, correct?
Contiguous.
That would be true because under the proposed regulations, number 1 is the 40-acre minimum. And there's no ability for the governing body to waive that. We had that same process with solar.
Okay, I'm sorry, go back one slide. I want to make sure I understand this. Where I had the 20 acres, more or less.
Can you go back to the prior slide with the 20 acres reference, please?
So it says permitted by right on property 20 acres or more. Are now we saying it's permitted by right 40 acres or more? And anything
No.
less than 40 acres has to be a conditional use?
In RR only, it's a conditional use, period. But they have to have 40 acres and that can't be waived. In the heavier districts, if it's 40 or more, yes, by right.
Okay, is everybody clear on that?
Well, as a practical, I mean, so I could build an event center 100 yards off the property line. Is that right or not?
The proposed setback is 200 feet, 300 from a dwelling that's not on the subject site. So yes, possibly.
So 300 feet, 100 yards. But it's got to be on 40 acres.
Correct.
So 100 yards off the right of way, but it's got to be on 40 acres. How can that make any sense? I mean, I don't understand that.
I guess my response would be that it's being viewed as two separate things. A greater setback, I think, is what you may be getting at. A greater setback could be suggested. But in discussion with staff, I think that's where staff came up with the best alternative at this point, the 200 and the 300. But you're correct, it'd be on 40 acres.
But JR, if you go out and find yourself 40 acres and drive out there 100 yards, I mean, you're not very deep into the 40 acres.
Agreed.
So why do you need 40 acres?
So I'll try and address that one. Mr. Nix, great question. So the 40 acres, what we've seen out in the county is we've seen a number of large lot subdivisions that have occurred. And as part of that, you'll get properties that are range in size from 1 acre to 5 acres. And what we've seen is we've seen a number of event centers come in applications that are either one of those subdivision parcels that's still out in the unincorporated county, or what we see sometimes is that they're right adjacent to them. So the thought process with both the 40 acres and the setbacks is to ensure that there's separation and distance between where these are being operated and neighbors in the area.
How many more people you can put on staff to do all these things we're talking about?
Well, so far, in terms of enforcement for something like this this would fall under our regular program. I believe that these regulations and the discussion about this has come up because there are so many event centers that are have applications that we've seen in the county. And it's not a tremendous amount, but it's enough that it's raised questions about, are our current regulations the best fit for Sedgwick County at this time? And the other thing in addition to that is that enough time has gone by between when the regulations were imposed, when the amendments were made, and when facilities have been operating, that we've received feedback from residents of the existing ones that are legally operating, and some of the issues that have been generated from those, or at least complaints.
Have we taken into consideration that regardless if you got 20, 40, whatever many acres that they're requiring, I see a financial obligation here that if we're going to change these rules, we owe to somebody, because if I'm going to put one of these in, so I go out and I buy 40 acres. Well, I don't have enough money to buy 40 acres. These farmers want so much money for their land nowadays that, and, oh, sorry. You.
How much is too much?
Well, there's never been a piece of property subdivided that the farmer didn't get benefit from it, so. No, what I'm saying to you is because what happens is then I go to the bank and the bank approves it based on my financial capabilities. So he buys it, he's got a mortgage now, and probably do that, and the construction loan and all this. Then all of a sudden you come over and say, hey, you can't do that. Because of these rules that we've got. And I think, you talk about 40 acres is a pretty good sized piece of ground. And I'm having a little problem with that from the standpoint of it can't be one way. It's got to be working together somehow, some way. And I think we're changing the rules, so it's upon us to educate, or whatever you want to call it.
Well, in response to that, if there's a different size that you think is more appropriate, I mean, certainly would love to discuss that. If there are stakeholders or groups that you think that we need to invite to have a conversation and go out and do outreach with to have a conversation, we're more than happy to do that as well.
Did you say that the 40 acres came from the meeting with the Board of County Commissioners? Was it a recommendation from one of the commissioners?
It was not. This started with staff. We were looking at a size of a property, what size would allow for the setbacks, and we figured what is a general ballpark size that would work well. We ended up with 40 acres because of the way that land is divided in quarter sections and et cetera. So to make sure that it was a regular size piece of property.
I know we need to move on, but I'm going to agree with John as much as I hate to here, but just the sheer cost of going out and buying 40 acres and then getting a construction loan to build an event center. I mean, you got a lot of money at play here. We better be we better make sure that anyone is able to understand what we're trying to accomplish here, I think.
The financial world will not understand this at all. I can guarantee you that.
So the recommended action here is to approve these changes for consideration by the MAPC. Do I'm hearing a different recommendation outside of the 40 acres? Is there a reduction? Is there, JR?
I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, you're fine.
So, thinking about what we've just heard, am I hearing that perhaps a smaller size with greater setbacks might be preferable to what's here?
That make a lot of sense to me.
Do you want to make that in the form of a motion, or do you want staff to review and bring back recommended changes?
John, what do you think? I interrupted you. I stepped on you.
Well, the size of the biggest complaints when the report was given to us was drunken driving, noise, dust. Well, I don't know how you're going to control any of those. The noise especially, how far does, you say it's going to be so many decibels, how far does it go to those decibels go? Is that within 2 miles, 1/2 mile, 1/4 mile? There's no way to judge that in this flatland that we live in, you know, they talk about Riley County. Well, Riley County's hilly and everything else and has a chance to block things out. But here it's just flat. We had this about a number of years ago with kennels, if you remember right. We had it with kennels because Joe Blow lived a half a mile away and he could hear the dogs barking. Yet between his house and the other house, there was 3 other houses and they all had dogs. And that's all I'm trying to say is that if we're going to do something, we need to maybe study it and come up with some kind of an idea, because I don't think, I hope the police department or the county doesn't spend more time finding out noise or this happened than doing the job of being police officers.
Well, noise, particularly out in the county, which I happen to live out in the county, certain frequencies, particularly low-level frequencies, travel for miles. I mean, and even visually. So I'm not in the flat part. I'm in the hilly part. I can see from my house the refinery in El Dorado. That's probably 20 miles away from me. So sound is a sticky wicket.
Might have to ban all railroad traffic.
Boy, amen to that.
Whoa. Hey, I would like to offer, an option would be to, if we've got daycares, it sounds like on November 7th, MAPC advanced plans. This could be another item to be considered by you again on November 7th. And that would give us time to come up with an option that would have a smaller property size, perhaps with, sounds like increased setbacks. It would also give us another opportunity to explore the noise and decibel levels with the sheriff's office and with MABCD to see if there's a solution or option that they prefer. The question to you all, and I think you've somewhat addressed it, but I don't know if I don't know if I've internalized which way you want to go on it, is it sounded like there were some concerns expressed about monitoring of noise out in the county, just in terms of staffing and how would that be accomplished. Are those concerns significant enough that we should not reach out to the sheriff's office and MABCD and others to try and find out what a recommended noise level would look like, or should we continue to do that research?
Well, it seems to me that the cases that we've had for event centers has always centered around that noise, and it'd probably be nice to find some kind of limits or some kind of recommendation. So that seems to always be the concern that has come up in the previous cases we've had. So I think we should explore it.
And going back to roads and the dust noise, I would hate to get like they do in California now, where if I'm going to put an event center or even a housing subdivision or a commercial or industrial, that I got to pave from paving to get to there. We're almost that way in the county now. In subdivisions, you got to pave to the first opening, get into the subdivision on a dirt road. And so, if you're going to require a 1/4 mile, 40 acres, so you're not going to do it right on the main drag, then you're in trouble. Because I can see one leading to the others, what I can see.
Okay, well, I think we have enough for staff to work on. Any other comments before I make a motion to defer? Seeing none, I make a motion to defer to the November 7th
Second.
Advanced Plans Committee. Second by Commissioner Johnson. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, say nay. Motion passes unanimously.
And I wasn't kidding about additional staff to take care of some of this stuff.
All right, Justin, item 5, short-term rentals.
Okay, item 5, short-term rentals in the county. Next slide, please. So again, the purpose of this item is to provide you with information about short-term rentals in the county. That is currently a use that is not permitted, so this would be a new use. Answer any questions that you may have regarding this topic, and then again, take a look at the Unified Zoning Code language that is provided in your packet and potentially make a recommendation to the full MAPC. Next slide, please. So we will discuss the issue of short-term rentals in the county. I'll provide you with some definitions of language that is proposed in the Unified Zoning Code, existing regulations, possible regulations. Those are the changes that you see before you, and then draft review and an update process. Next slide, please. So what is the issue? Next slide. So in most situations, it is not legal to operate a short-term rental in the unincorporated county. The existing Unified Zoning Code does not allow any stays less than 7 days. Next slide, please. So a lot of communities currently are working to identify the right fit for their community. Our most recent changes to the Unified Zoning Code occurred back in September 2023, and that was changes to the city short-term rental policy. Next slide, please. A little bit of background. Next slide, please. So back in November, almost a year ago, Sedgwick County Board of County Commissioners held a staff meeting and received a staff presentation on short-term rentals in the unincorporated county. Again, it was just generally research and what we found from other communities and what our current regulations were. We did provide a research memorandum. We presented that to this committee back on November 30th of 2023, discussing our state of the practice report and what that looks like in the unincorporated county. In December, we took that information that we received from the Advanced Plans Committee back to the Board of County Commissioners and had further discussion regarding short-term rentals in the county. And currently, what was adopted for the city was approved by Sedgwick County in December of 2023. Next slide, please. So most recently, we held 2 meetings with the Board of County Commissioners, one in September. It was a staff meeting, and they received a presentation from staff with a lot of the information that you'll see today regarding findings and possible changes to the Unified Zoning Code. We received feedback from them at that September meeting and then presented that updates to them in October of draft changes, and also received additional thoughts and feedback from them. So a lot of the draft changes that you see in front of you today resemble feedback that we received from the Board of County Commissioners. Next slide, please. So short-term rental in the city, this is how it is currently defined. Again, specifically, this is the city. It's the use of a residential dwelling unit or structure to provide rooms for temporary lodging or lodging and meals for transient guests on a paying basis. It may be owner or manager occupied, and it also includes the bed and breakfast inn definition. Next slide, please. When we think about short-term rentals, these are typically the companies that are associated with that. So just to kind of get an example of what we're trying to address here, Airbnb, VRBO, those types of companies. Next slide. Here's some examples of what they would look like. These are not structures. I don't believe these are structures that are in Sedgwick County currently, but just to give you kind of a good feel of what we're trying to address here with this potential language change. Next slide. Possible regulations, and this is where we kind of get into the text changes that are in your packet. Next slide. So we added a new definition for short-term rental in the county. Currently, as I mentioned before, this definition does not exist. We have one for the city, but the changes would include a new definition for the county. It would always require an administrative permit or a conditional use. And an administrative permit or conditional use for short-term rental shall be valid for 5 years, therefore must be renewed every 5 years. Next slide, please. Permitted only in residential dwelling units and permitted in apartments. May be permitted as either a primary use or as an accessory use, and not permitted in any recreational vehicle. So Airstreams, that type of structure, it would not be permitted. Next slide. So an owner, operator, or property owner must be designated for the short-term rental. That owner or property manager shall live within 30 miles of that short-term rental. They would be generally available 24 hours per day, 7 days a week to respond to any concerns or complaints. And that owner must post their contact information in a conspicuous and accessible location within that short-term rental dwelling unit. Next slide, please. No gathering of more than 20 adults. For the purposes of this subsection, an adult is any person over the age of 12. Above 20 adults, they can apply for a conditional use. So there is an option, there is a path forward if you have more than 20 adults. Any short-term rental in the county is subject to inspection by the zoning administrator or designee, building official or designee, and by the fire chief. Next slide, please. Use of the short-term rental in the county is limited to activities that are incidental, customary, and accessory to the residential dwelling unit. Weekly residential trash service shall be provided with an adequate number of trash receptacles on site, and then it must be in compliance at all times with any applicable building, fire, and zoning codes. Next slide, please. Possible administrative process. This is what it would kind of look like. An application would be submitted to allow a short-term rental in the county. We would send out notification letters to the owners of abutting and contiguous properties, very similar to the agenda item that we looked at earlier today. More than 50% of the owners and abutting and contiguous property owners, if they protest it, then it would become a conditional use application. If they do not, then the administrative permit would be approved. Next slide, please. Here's an example of what a short-term rental would look like. Obviously, very similar to the last slide. Mustard property is the subject property. Light blue are the contiguous properties. Next slide, please. Here's kind of a good example of what that would look like in the county. That previous image was obviously in a more dense location, but this subject property, this rectangular piece in mustard would be the subject property, and the blue properties would be the protest properties surrounding it. Next slide, please. Here's another example. Again, just showing you many different options of what that would look like. Next slide. And another. Next slide. Again, the owner of the property, the owners of record would be the ones that are receiving those notifications. Next slide, please. And this one is regarding monitoring these properties. Typically right now it is complaint-based in the county. A 5-year cycle of application and related application fees are built into this process that we are proposing today. Next slide, please. Current feedback that we've received from the Board of County Commissioners, I'll go through that briefly on the next slide. So there is a desire to get this language into the Unified Zoning Code. We did have several questions come up regarding taxation and fairness. There was some discussion about whether or not 5 bedrooms or less equal a residential property. Question about business registration was a big discussion, whether or not these Airbnbs or VRBOs or short-term rentals should be required to register as a business. There's some discussion kind of outside of what is proposed today, which is zoning code specifically, but those were topics that were brought up. Next slide, please. We'll go into the draft review and update process. Next slide. Here's kind of what our timeline looks like. Again, this would be a recommendation for approval to the MAPC today. And then our goal would be to bring this to the Board of County Commissioners in December, and then with final approval from the Wichita City Council in January. Next slide, please. Again, just recommendation to change the Unified Zoning Code regarding short-term rentals in the county and make that recommendation to the MAPC. And I'm available for any questions.
Thank you, Justin. Any questions from the commissioners? Mr. McKay.
Do you have any idea how many of these there might be in the county?
Yeah, JR, do you want to cover that one? Or I mean, I'm
No,
equipped to.
So the city has a company that we've hired to help us monitor. You saw there were 500 and some, there were actually about 459 as of this morning, different units.
Is that including the city?
That is
Only
only
county.
the corporate limits of Wichita. The company has looked at it, and I think the best guess, just the last I heard, we've not gotten a final answer from the company, but I think we're looking at a dozen,
Yeah, I think.
maybe a dozen, no more than 20, but I think somewhere around a dozen is what's in the unincorporated county, not the other cities, just the unincorporated county.
So with that in mind, 600,000 population theoretically around here. So for 12 deals, we're going to rewrite or add more regulations and stuff to that. Is that the goal?
You're right ahead.
So this one is, this is an issue that's come up a number of times in the unincorporated county. What we found is similar to the event centers. There are property owners who wish to do this, and we often see it in conjunction with event centers where they want to have kind of guest rooms or building structures that folks can rent out overnight while they're having an event there. This is coming to us not as something necessarily that we're looking at changing the regulations, imposing them on something, but right now this use generally is not permitted per the zoning code out in the county, and we are getting requests to please make it a permitted use in some form or fashion. And so this is an attempt to create a custom kind of approach for Sedgwick County that hopefully is a good fit. We had discussions about should it be modeled direct, should it be a copy of what the city of Wichita does? And so far, the thought process is no, it should be modeled and based on that, but it should be customized to meet Sedgwick County's needs.
Well, I only remember in my recollection, which is kind of dim most of the time, we only approved, we had one on North Woodlawn not too long ago, where they wanted to put an event center along with cabins and stuff like that. And we approved that without all of this regulation for one specific portion of that thing. And I guess that's where I'm coming from, is that we got a timeline up there that we want to get done today, tomorrow, and yesterday. And so you've thrown an awful lot at us that we got to prove and be done in the next so many months, weeks, whatever it is. So.
Well, and number one, just this is a lot of information, and I apologize for that. But we've had a number of things that have queued up on the county side, and we've been occupied with the solar for quite some time. So when we got done with that, we rolled into these. The other thing too is that most of the stuff that you've seen, JR has been so considerate and put it together along with legal, but the issue has been that there's been adjustments and tweaks, and in the discussions with the county commission at the BOCC staff meetings, I think we've gotten the sense that we're headed on the right approach, but it really is a question about do we need to dial it in more? So that's why you're seeing all of these things all at once. I do acknowledge that there's not a firm time commitment in terms of when these need to get done, so they can be discussed further out if you'd like.
Well, if that's the case, then it's saying you bring it to the MAPC next week, and then we had a timeline. And if you want to do something like this, bring it to us. We're going to have a work study deal for this committee, then do the recommendation. Because you're catching us with this, I haven't even read this stuff, quite frankly.
And that is one of the bits of feedback. I mean, there's multiple notes that I'm making here, but one of the bits of feedback is to, in the future, when we've got a zoning code amendment, to schedule 2 meetings with the Advanced Plans Committee. We do want to try, although it's not a firm commitment or an absolute deadline, we do want to try and get these. My goal would be to try and get the ones that folks are comfortable with to the Board of County Commissioners by the end of the year. That's a personal goal that I've got, but there's not a firm deadline on those.
Commissioner Aldrich.
I've got a whole different problem. It's one thing continuing changing regulations, zoning, and everything else within a municipality. There's a reason why people love to live out in the county. The wide open spaces, the freedom to do a lot more on their property than what's allowed within the structure of of a municipality. It sounds like we're going down a path that next thing you know, a vet out in the county is only going to require certain types of vehicles, whether it's EVs or whether it's pickup trucks or what. And at some point, there's an overreach, I think, from government. And I think we're knocking on that door. I mean, that's just my own personal thing here, but you know, how much regulations are we going to have out in the county, you know, on some of the stuff I think is, you know, stepping over that boundary a little bit, but that's just me.
JR?
So I would reiterate, as of right now, probably every single one of the short-term rentals in the county, just like it was in the city, are illegal. They're not permitted. They're simply not legal. So this would be a way to make them legal.
Yeah, but when you have a situation where you have
12
someone,
units? Or 20 or 30
Or, yes,
in 600,000 population?
that's correct.
but when you have a situation that you have somebody that owns, you know, 100, 200,000 acres or whatever, and it's pretty good hunting. Well, state of Kansas allows out-of-state hunters, you know, with licensing and everything else. So is that not really a short-term rental or a short-term event center or something when you have 5 or 6 or 10 hunters coming in on one section of property just to hunt deer, or you have 20 or 30 hunters coming in to hunt pheasant? You know, and we have that everywhere. And so basically on a situation like that, this is going to lead to you're going to tell those property owners, oh yeah, you can't do that anymore.
That's,
And I think that's wrong.
that's an interesting question, being a hunter in name. It's good exercise. That's an interesting question because most of the hunts probably won't be longer than a week. That's interesting. An interesting point.
I think we're just going down a slippery slope here. I think it's dangerous, you know, to do that. You know, it's stay within your bailiwick, stay within the city. Don't be messing too much around the county.
So are you suggesting that the regulations don't change and in the county short-term rentals as a use would not be
What I'm
made
saying
legal?
is be very, very cautious on changing things or regulating things. You know, if there's something that's, it's almost like, and I hate to say it this way, but I pretty much believe anybody can do anything he or she wants to do in this country as long as it doesn't infringe on the rights of others. You know, and, you know, property rights end at the end of your property. I get that. But I just think that we have to be very, very, very careful on what we do and the ramifications that if we do this, this is going to happen over here. Because there's always a reaction to every action that's taken. You know, be very careful that you don't infringe on the property rights. And I'm just, there's a lot of flags, a lot of concerns that I have when it comes to regulations anyway. And I just want to make sure that we're not hurting somebody's rights.
Understood. Appreciate that.
So, Joe, Johnson?
Yeah, I want to make sure we judge our staff by what we don't do as well as what we do. I don't think they need to turn out a bunch of stuff to prove their worth. Is that fair?
Did this request for the short-term rentals in the unincorporated Sedgwick County come from the county commissioners?
It did, yes, sir. This was initiated, this one, the event centers, and then another one on the agenda, which is signs in the unincorporated county were initiated by the county commission.
Okay. And was there specific cases that were problematic, or was it just the general growth of the short-term rental?
Yes, sir. There are,
Business.
there's at least one, possibly two instances of short-term rentals that they have been problematic in terms of the property owners really wanting to be able to operate this type of business and not having the ability to do that. The property owners have been given the option of going through a PUD for custom zoning. However, I think the feedback that we've received is that folks have looked at, should there be a more holistic look at the regulations and how short-term rentals are handled in the county?
But they could do it by PUD.
They could, yes, today they could turn in an application.
And I believe the property Commissioner McKay referred to earlier up on North Woodlawn, that was done by a PUD, I believe.
Okay.
Would it be possible to maybe have a workshop, sit down in the same room with the county commissioners and discuss some of this stuff and what they're looking for and everything?
It is possible to request that. Obviously I can't make any promises, but you can always request that if you'd like. The full MAPC could.
It's also,
maybe-
nothing prevents us individually from talking to those county commissioners and having these discussions separately.
No, sir. As long as there's not like a particular
Correct.
in-game or serial meetings taking place,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay.
Well, it'd be nice to have maybe at some point, maybe once a year or whatever, just to have a sit down with the county commissioners. I'm not too sure about this city council, but with at least with the county commissioners, because there's a lot of new territory, things that are happening and going on out there with the changes. People are moving out, they're growing, and everything's expanding, and I think it'd be productive to do that.
Well, what we can also offer, in addition to that, is we can also send you the videos, the links. You wouldn't have to view them if you don't want to, but you would have that option to view this, the BOCC staff meeting, so you can see the dialogue that took place at those from the county commissioners, and that could provide some additional context as well.
Okay, seeing no other questions, the recommended action is to recommend these changes to the MAPC for approval. What is the will of the board? Do we want to defer to give more time, or do we want to push this forward to the MAPC to have this discussion?
You made the last motion, two motions.
And that was for deferral. So
I move that we defer and have more time to read and go through it.
Second.
I have a motion to defer and a second. Any other discussion? Seeing none. Now, hold on, the question. So Bob was alternate when we didn't have a quorum. We have a quorum with 4 without him. Does his second still count?
Yes, and technically, since Commissioner Aldrich is now the vice chair, he actually should be a formal member of the Advanced Plans Committee. So his vote does
Okay.
count.
Cool, thank you.
She's got
All
my
right.
back.
And then if you could clarify that the motion is to defer until the next Advanced Plans
Right.
meeting, or November 7th.
Correct.
That's not my motion. My motion was to defer till we have a chance to look at it. And from the looks of this, we still got 7 more, 8 more items to go over this thing today. And so if we take 30 minutes on each one of them,
I understand, sir. I was just making sure that there was a date
Clarity.
attached to the deferral.
but the deferral, it doesn't have to be date specific, does it?
It's supposed to be, yes, sir. And I think we did that for the last 2
November the
motions.
7th, 2051.
What was the date?
2051.
That's what I'm saying.
Is there a second?
Some of these others may be, the venue in the county, to me, is a lot more important than whether or not we got 12 units or 15 or however many units out there that somebody is renting and probably not bothering anybody, other than somebody called a county commissioner and said, hey, we got this deal, we don't like it. Because in a lot of those cases, it's people, it's family farm has been there, they moved into a newer house, took the old house, remodeled it, and using it for a venue, not a venue, but a bed and breakfast. So,
Commissioner McKay, if that's your position, you certainly can make a motion to not approve the draft change and not recommend approval to the MAPC.
but I think we need more time to look at it. That's my point. Now, you tell me how I legally can get there.
No, I was just saying that we can defer it, but if that's your position and you don't think you'll change, then you certainly could make an alternate motion.
I do.
I'm not objecting to a deferral. I was just making sure that
Just
we
want some
got a
clarity.
date.
But you want
Yes.
a date certain, that's the only thing I'm talking about now.
If I may,
Date certain.
perhaps with that, and this is for consultation with everyone, which is, since this is not a public hearing item, I wonder if it would be possible to just defer it. I agree. I was going to ask the same question on, is there a specific date? But if the intent is not to have a specific date, since it's not a public hearing item, then could, that would allow staff then to confer with the chair of the MAPC advanced plans to see if they're okay with whenever it is
Bring it
they're ready to
back
put it on. Yeah.
When it's ready.
Mr. Chair, so generally a deferral would be to a specific date, and that is related to notice of the meeting, and in the hearings, of course, notice of those hearings. Excuse me. What does everyone think about maybe just moving to pull this off the agenda for a vote, and then when it is ready to come back on, the department planning could put it back on the agenda?
I have a question. Now, you said until it's ready to be put back on. How is that going to be determined whether it's ready? Is that going to be from input from the commissioners, or is there going to be a workshop on this, or is it just from staff recommendations and then we're back in the same boat?
I think that is the difficulty of not choosing another date.
I would address that one to say that staff come up with the ideas in terms of just a draft of what the agenda could look like, but we always look to the chairperson of the committee, whether in this case advanced plans, to determine what the final agenda should be. So we would look to the chairperson to determine whether or not it's ready.
I think we ought to follow that policy.
So the motion was indefinitely, correct, Mr. McKay?
Tell me how it changes what I said, other
think
than a
you-
date certain.
Based on what the conversation I'm hearing is, you either can defer it, but if you defer it, legal counsel's advising that it should be to a date certain, or it sounds like there's the other option of potentially with tabling the item maybe. Would that be a better way of doing it?
Yes, I think that would
I
work.
make a motion that we table the item
Indefinitely.
until second, indefinitely.
We have a motion and a second. Any other comment?
Do we have to withdraw our first motion?
No, it's a friendly motion. It's a friendly, he's adjusting his motion, so.
I'll adjust if I have to.
You
if I still
agreed
have
to
second,
adjust?
I'll make that adjustment
Okay.
also.
And you agree to that. Thank you. All right. We're all clear. We're all good? All right. All in favor, say aye.
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 Opposed, say nay. Motion passes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, because Commissioner Nix has left. That's what I was just saying. Commissioner Nix has left, so it'd be 5-0.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes, sir.
seeing the hour is getting late and we have a lot to go yet,
Yes.
what would be a proper motion to either speed through them or defer to the next meeting? Is there anything, Scott, that really needs action?
I can try and breeze through all of them right now, and then you can tell me. Yeah.
So first off, the item 6 is development signs in the county. Is there a timetable on that one that it needs decided at this meeting?
No, there's not.
Okay. So with that being said, and then items 7, 8, and 9 are updates to existing plans that we've been working through. And you're saying you can breeze through those fairly quickly?
Yes, sir.
I'm happy to breeze through agenda items 7 and 8 very, very quickly if you'd like.
Okay. And then 10, the drought update, how much time would you need for that one?
2 minutes.
2 minutes, okay. So with that being said, then I move that we table item 6, development signs in the county, to the November 7th Advanced Plans Committee.
Mr. Chair, so that would be a deferral.
Right, because I
know
put a
it.
specific date on it.
Yes.
Thank you for the correction. Appreciate that. So my motion is adjusted to say defer to the November 7th meeting.
Second,
Okay.
we have a failure to communicate.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, say nay. Okay, motion approved, 5-0, and that is deferred. Okay, so now we're on item 7, parking RFP update.
I'll quickly go through this one, Mr. Chairperson. As you all know, MAPD is currently undergoing a process to review and align our parking requirements with community goals. So we'd be looking at potentially updating both the UZC, the Unified Zoning Code, and the Comprehensive Plan. We solicited proposals back in April of 2024, and we did receive 6 proposals. We formed a selection committee. We met on May 22nd. Chose to reject all the responses to the RFP because they didn't align with what we are currently looking at. We sent out the request for proposals again, received new proposals, and we met as a selection committee and selected 3 firms to interview. We did conduct those interviews back in September 16th to be exact, and the project was just awarded to one of those consultants last week. So the purchasing department is currently in the process of drafting a contract, and we hope to have everything finalized very soon on this one.
Okay. Any comments or any questions for staff? Seeing none, move on to item 8, please.
College Hill Neighborhood Plan. As you all are aware, we're working with stakeholders to develop a plan for the College Hill neighborhood. We hosted a community kickoff meeting back in November. We've done an online survey since then. We've had several steering committee meetings. We had our 8th steering committee meeting yesterday, actually, on October 23rd. It was in person from 4 to 6 p.m. here in our planning offices. We discussed strategies and actions specifically surrounding mobility in the College Hill neighborhood. We plan to have a series of steering committee meetings through November to analyze feedback provided by the steering committee members and begin drafting strategies and actions for the plan in total. That's that item.
Okay, any questions for staff on College Hill Neighborhood Plan? Seeing none, we're done with you. So motion to receive and file Justin's 7 and 8.
Sure we're done with him?
Justin, I think so.
I can stay here all day. It's okay.
All right, motion and a second. All in favor, say aye. Aye. All opposed, say nay. Motion passes unanimously. Scott, MAPD update.
Yes, in the interest of time, I'll just do those from here. For the MAPD update, I would just indicate that we've really reviewed quite a bit of the materials that would be in there. I did not get the case numbers put together, so we'll have to work on that and distribute that afterwards. It's just been a busy last couple weeks, but we're staying pretty busy in terms of activity, and you can see the results of the advanced plans efforts today. So that's all I've got on MAPD update.
Sure. Any questions for Scott? Seeing none, we'll move on to item 10, drought update.
Yeah, on the drought update, this is simply to make you aware of what's been implemented. So, of course, City of Wichita's in the drought. And at the same time, we also have the landscape code, which requires landscape to be installed in certain instances. And so what we've done in response to the drought is we are now issuing letters to indicate that the requirement to install the landscaping has been suspended for now. And that it will be reactivated essentially when the drought is lifted and when the appropriate planting season comes up. So there's a number of those letters that we're keeping track of. And when the drought gets lifted and the growing season starts to approach, we'll start to notify folks that that requirement will be back in place.
I'd like to say one thing about that particular, is the fact that I think Hugh, who's the most knowledgeable person I know about this, maybe in your guidelines of what they can put in there, the one that, like he said, there's some that you can put in and they won't be alive there 6 months from now. And I mean, about the list of suggestions, I guess, of the type of shrubbery and stuff that goes in.
Yes, sir. And that's one of the requests that I actually have for our advanced plan staff following this meeting will be to have staff get with Mr. Nix and go through the list of approved plants. We defer to some other agencies who have developed those lists and to identify if there are any plants that he would recommend anyway that probably should be taken off as an option because of the water amount that they use.
I have a quick question regarding the Equisbed. Does anybody know what the current level is or percentage of the Equisbed is at?
I do not.
Last I heard, it was 90+%.
That's what I heard too.
Yeah.
It was conversation. I didn't know how true that
Yeah.
was. You know, plastic plants are good.
Mr. Mader.
In regard to the. You'll have to grab another one, I'm sorry, sir. Okay. Here you go, I can talk real loud, but I need it, okay.
Because you've used it so much.
There's not time for me, but.
In regard to the landscape requirement and the letter of a deferral, how is that specifically then being enforced? Because we don't even enforce landscaping ordinance to begin with.
Sounds like we could do another presentation on enforcement of landscaping. That's a whole, it'd be a good topic, but so it comes down to code enforcement and working with MABCD and planning to enforce that. We are keeping a list of all of the letters that we send out because in order to get their building permits, they have to comply with installing the landscaping. So in lieu of installing the landscaping, we're providing them with a letter that's addressed to them, indicating that that's been deferred until the drought's lifted. We're keeping track of those so that, again, when the drought gets lifted, we can send out letters again saying, hey, we know you've gotten a deferral. We've got you on the list. And please note that things have changed. And now in the appropriate growing season, you're going to be responsible for getting that installed.
I'm just curious about the enforcement procedure because I don't see any enforcement going on when things aren't planted or they're let to die. How are we going to enforce something that's completely new?
So we work on a complaint basis. Now, we're talking landscaping, right? So that's part of the building process. So MABCD handles,
Right.
in theory, the initial install. The building inspectors are supposed to be versed in this, and they should do this before a full C of O is given. If that doesn't happen, planning, my group, the zoning enforcement division, we're probably not going to know unless someone calls us, hey, they didn't put their landscaping in. And then after the fact, we do not go, I have 2 people to cover the largest city in the state. We're not checking. If we get complaints, we do, however, and we will respond to those. We'll get the plans out. We'll go out and look. And I mean, I used to take abuse from my workmates because I would count trees and shrubs. But we do that and we do enforce. Does that help?
Maybe we ought to set up a enforcement committee that maybe. To go visit these.
No, I don't think I will.
All right. Thank you, Scott. Any other questions? All right, seeing none, I guess receive and file. Motion, that's my motion to receive and file. Scott's report on drought. Need a second? Second. Thank you. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed say nay. Motion passes unanimously. Public comment, sir, did you have any? No? Okay, thank you for being here. Thank you. Other business? I would just like to point out that the November 7th meeting will be a doozy because we obviously have deferred a lot, but also Bob Aldrich will be named chair of Advanced Plans later this afternoon, so it'll be his meeting to run. I don't know if that'll make it more of a doozy. But
The chair usually doesn't talk a lot.
with that said, we are adjourned.
Rough crowd trying.
I'd like to compliment you. I think a lot of work's, and we have a lot of reading to do.
Thank you, sir. We appreciate that.
And thank you very much for the feedback. This has been very, very helpful.